Right, there we go.
Now, Ron, how do we get her back?
You all should be able to see my screen at this point, and then maybe me if you're.
Yeah, that's it. So she's in charge of that. Thank you.
Okay, one further thing before Cameron begins. This is the first of two sessions that we're going to be having with Cameron. She will be with us again by Zoom on October the 27th. So I hope that you'll be a part of both of these conversations and you'll come back for that. So Cameron, thank you for being with us, and take it away.
All right, thank you. And I'm now currently staring at the ceiling of the whatever room we're in, which is a lovely ceiling. But if you want me to see your faces, yeah,
Is
there
it
you go.
better?
That's way better.
Way better. Okay.
Nicer to see humans.
Okay, good.
All right, so it's great to connect with you all, and thank you for spending the next at least hour together while we nerd out on the future of church and the future of spirituality. My intention with this first conversation is to try to lay some framework and groundwork for kind of the big trends that are happening right now in human existence and human institutions, and their impact on institutional religion. So we're really going to fly at kind of a 40,000 foot level, maybe even higher than that. The next webinar that we'll do together is actually going the opposite direction. We'll go on a tour of creative congregations who are doing interesting things right now that, with you over or seeing what they're up to or overhearing what they're up to, might provoke some creativity in what is possible for you. So today, again, is big picture trends. Let's get oriented to kind of what's impacting our current context. And then the next conversation is let's get nitty gritty and think about your particular context. So weirdly, in addition to having been a congregational consultant for 25 years, I've been the pastor of 4 congregations. I've been a national denominational leader with the UCC, and also served in conference ministry. In addition to all of that, I am also a commercial pilot. And I mostly prefer to talk about aviation over anything else. So if we can work in aviation metaphors in our conversation today, it's a big win. Gold star, and Jesus sends you extra love. So when I went to flight school, which was an interesting experience, and a million years ago now, I had this really extraordinary instructor. So I went in assuming that in flight school, you would begin that journey by having hours and hours and hours of ground school. Like, one would think that you would actually want to know something about flying at the, intellectually, right? So I thought I'd go in and learn about lift, maybe like, how do we get this thing off the ground? Or, how do you use your rudder pedals even, or how do I not run into other airplanes, for example? But my instructor, instead of hours and hours of ground school, he just put me in an airplane and we go flying. And I repeatedly assured him that the only competence that I brought to that experience was the tendency to kill us both. But he just kept me in the air, kept me practicing this. And then when we landed, he gave me all the aviation books that I needed, but instead of forcing me into that, which he thought I could do on my own time, he instead started showing me these incredible pieces of art. It was a really curious experience. Now, why would an aviation instructor start showing me pieces of art? What he understood that I did not understand at that point is that in aviation, the most dangerous factor in any flight is the pilot's inability to see what is so right in front of them, to miss an indicator light, or to be so obsessed with their instrument panel that they fail to look out the window at an airplane that's coming right at them, or to not attend to the radar when clearly you're about to fly into a storm. So it's the pilot's inability to have eyes to see and ears to hear, as our scriptures might say, or do say, that actually is the one factor of flight that can't be accounted for at this point, at least in aviation, by technology. And that is the one piece that he wanted to make sure I understood most keenly. So what he was doing by showing me these pieces of art was to train me to start to see what was in front of me and to question the assumptions and the biases that I might have, the quick moves to judgment that might actually prevent me from actually seeing what is so. So I want to run you through, just as a fun exercise, some of the pieces that he showed me, and we're just going to talk about what you think you're seeing. So this first photo that I'm going to show you is a photograph that was taken during World War II by a photographer who was in following some soldiers in that space. It's a bit grainy because it was taken in non-ideal circumstances and just the generation of the film that it was taken on. But let's see what you see when you take a look at this picture. Somebody's probably going to have to speak into the microphone the responses you're getting in the room, just so I can, like, what do you see in this photo?
Okay, somebody said a cow.
Okay.
Becky Crosby, one of our ministers, said the Annunciation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did she have a little too much communion wine?
No.
Yeah.
Okay, what else? What else do we see? What else do we see? A map?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, with grid lines here.
Land and water. Yep. A turtle shell.
Yes.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, so it's
Okay, go ahead.
See, it's interesting, isn't it, that we can all be looking at the same photo and we all see different things, or we at least are mystified a bit. Now, whoever said a cow, you nailed it. So that is exactly what you're seeing. Now, I'm going to now put it in relief for you so that you can see that this is actually a close-up of a cow. And now if I go back to the original photo, you can't not see the cow, right? Like now when you see this photo for all of time going forward, you will know this is in fact a cow. But what I was doing or trying to do in my setup for you is confuse you, because what I was talking about before I showed you this image was flight. I was, saying, I was sort of building up to, we're going to look at 30,000 feet. Let me tell you about my flight instructor, et cetera. And so sometimes in our brains, we go into looking at something with the assumptions of the setup that we're expecting to see. So some of you may have assumed, if I'd done my job right, that you would see an aerial photograph that I was, setting you up to look at something like that. But in fact, that's not it at all, right? So they're blind spots and assumptions that you and I are holding every day. They're stories we're telling ourselves about how the world is, how the church is, how we relate to each other, what are the conditions of our current reality, that are full of assumptions and blind spots. The fun of this moment is that almost every one of those is being called into question. And we're seeing that in the challenges to the institutions that we're now a part of. So the wondering about what are the blind spots that I'm holding? What are the assumptions that I'm carrying that may be my way of clearer seeing? Now, here's another photograph that I wanted to show you. This is just an extraordinary artist. Her name is Kumi Yamashita. And you can't see it from this level. So think of this as like a 30,000 foot level. But this is a piece of art. This is on a piece of plywood, a large piece of plywood, and each one of those dots is a large brad, but the head of the brad is like it's not diamond, but it's like a clear plastic beautiful little stud. And then the black that makes up this portrait is actually one long piece of black thread, of black yarn, that she has woven through these different studs there to make this image. I mean, it's just exceptional. Now, from here, from this perspective at 30,000 feet, you can't see all of that detail. But if I take you a little bit closer, now you can start to see some of the extraordinary artistry and what makes up, this particular piece. And if I take you even closer, let's say down to 2,000 feet of elevation, right? Then or altitude, then here you can really see the artistry that she's put in. Now, if I had shown you this picture, you never could have, or any of us could have sussed out the larger photograph. So our proximity to the thing we're looking at, or the question we're trying to answer, or the conundrum that we're wrestling with matters, because everything is in relationship to each other, but our access to understanding that relationship changes based on our proximity to it, what is actually revealed to us. So from here we can see the whole, right? But from closer up we can see part of the whole, but the intimate details of it. Now here's another example I want us to play with here. So this was a experiment done by Daniel Simmons back in 2010, as it says on your screen. There have since been a number of other experiments in similar kind. What I want you to do is, this is going to be a video we're going to play, and I want you to track the people in the white shirts, and I want you to count how many times the ball passes from one person in a white shirt to another person in the white shirt. Now, the ball can bounce. That still counts as one. So sometimes they throw it on the ground and it bounces to the next person. That's totally fine. So that's just one. So watch the people in the white shirts and how many times they pass the ball back and forth to each other. Okay, how many times did you count?
All right. I have it on good record that it is 16 times.
Did
Oh no,
somebody
somebody else counted 15.
ah
Somebody else counted 13.
ah
Somebody else counted 11.
oh my gosh.
17. Yeah, anyway, okay.
Yep, good. All right, so the official count is 16. So bravo to whoever got that. Now, how many of you saw the big black gorilla walk right through the middle of the room? How many of you missed it? Yes, good. Oh, it's such a comfort, because the first time I saw this, I totally missed that there is this ginormous gorilla that walks across the screen. So we're
What
going to
are
go.
you even talking about? What gorilla?
Yep, watch it again. So here we go. We're just going to watch this one more time. Do you all see? There's a ginormous black gorilla that just walks
All right,
across.
that's awesome.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, so here's the interesting thing about this experiment is, because I told you to watch the people in the white t-shirts, your vision, your brain said to your eyeballs, don't track anything in this scene except the color white and how many times the ball moves between the color white. And so your peripheral, or your vision, not just peripheral, but your whole vision screened out this huge gorilla that walked right across the screen. I mean, how much more obvious could it get, right? So we all have these blind spots that are just part of being human. And what that invites right now, when we're living in this time of extraordinary upheaval and change, is the slowing down to wonder and question, what are we seeing and what are we missing? What are the opportunities that actually are before us now that may be unique in this moment of human history? So I'm not going to be the person that's telling you the doom and gloom, like, oh, the church is dying, everything is terrible. I will tell you the church as we know it is changing in fundamental and huge ways. But I mean, my bias, there may never have been a more exciting time to be a part of this movement. And if I'm being really snarky, the fun of this in part is because in large part, mainline Christianity is declining so fast that we should try something wild and crazy, because it's not like we can kill the church any faster, right? So that was said in jest. So the question then is, so if we're living in an age now where we get to ask new questions of spirituality, of Christianity, of the church, then what is the context in which we are being invited into that inquiry? Like what is being revealed to us in this time of the great unveiling? So if you think about just in the past, let's just say the last 20 years, maybe, the scale of change that you and I have lived through, just in that short little time period. Think about 2008. We saw 2008 to 10. We saw the great financial meltdown. We're now living through climate breakdown, COVID lockdown, racial throwdown, Christian letdown, and today we're watching the extraordinary show of technology showdown. So when you think about maybe your level of exhaustion or frustration or increasing levels of burnout that we're seeing among more and more of us, if you're feeling a little frayed around the edges, well, you're certainly not alone. These are part of the conditions in which you and I are living and moving and having our being. Philosopher Jean Houston, who is extraordinary, she lives out on the West Coast, and I've studied her work for a long, long time. She said one time, she said, you have to understand that you and I are living 10 to 100 times the life experiences of our ancestors, even just 2 or 3 generations ago. The scale of change and the scale of shifting of our way of life, of the pace at which we're living, is unprecedented in human history. We've never before seen this in our evolution. And so if you're feeling the pressure of that, the disorientation of that, then that is actually entirely evolutionarily normal. Here's one way of thinking about it, that according to trauma therapists, the kind of the way that we stay integrated, fully whole and as humans, balanced, is that they think of it as that we have a balance of spiritual, physical, psychological, social, and I'm saying financial, and by that I mean a sense of safety and security, that we're not at the survival, fight, flight, freeze kind of reptilian mode in our minds. And what's happening right now is that we're seeing a break in those spaces in a lot of us. And what trauma therapists teach us is that what that creates is a break in our response ability, our ability to respond to the challenges of our own personal lives, and an ability to respond to the challenges of our communities and then in the broader world. So in our inability to respond in healthy and creative ways, what ends up happening to us as a culture is that we end up looking for relief, looking for some other way of dealing with this trauma. And so we're seeing unprecedented and understandable rates of people needing to take antidepressants, who are self-medicating through drugs, alcohol, other addictions, who are just trying to survive the moment in the ways that they can survive the moment. Because again, we're experiencing such an extraordinary shift in the pattern and pacing of what it means to be human. But that, of course, has corporate effects on our culture. Because now what we're also seeing, and in part what's adding to the individual psychological experience, is that because of all of those breakdowns and meltdowns and letdowns that we talked about earlier, we're actually seeing the realities of what has been true for a long time, but now what is being revealed, that the institutions that were formed by previous generations and have brought us this far are insufficient at this moment to carry us further into a future that can adapt and hold the level of global diversity that we're now in contact with for the first time again in human experience. All of these cultures and all of these different archetypal stories and all of the different mythologies and theologies have existed in this world for all of time, but never before have we needed to integrate that level of diversity into day-to-day Western life, Western culture. And I could speak more broadly than that. And so our institutions were not designed to do that. As you all have probably studied, like mainline Christianity was in part formed primarily to hold the institutional gains of white people over many, many generations, right? So our institutions were formed in an imagination and in a time that is not sufficient to carry us forward. And so we're starting to see the fracturing of that, the questioning of that. Our political systems are the same way, our education systems, our healthcare systems. We're seeing this kind of fracturing, our economic systems, all along the way. And that is in part inviting a crisis of a collective story. Now, in the Western mindset, our collective story has always revolved around the kind of independent, individualist, rugged, Western cowboy mentality, right? Pull yourself up by the bootstraps, this sort of fierce, like fight to the death kind of mentality. It gets lived out right now in, for example, Marvel movies, Iron Man being one of the best examples of the Western collective story, who's the capitalist turned hero, who ultimately saves the world. But what we're increasingly realizing is that nobody's coming to save us, and that the messes that we're in at this point are of an existential level, again, unique in human history. So never before have we faced climate change, the possibility of matricide, planetary matricide, where we're killing Mother Earth. We've not lived in an age for very long where nuclear weapons now can be procured not just by nation states, but by rogue networks. So we're living in a different kind of context that offers different challenges and I would argue different opportunities. Another way to think about this is to think of it in kind of a layered framework here. At the base level, there's a story that each culture tells itself about what it's up to, what it means to live a meaningful life. What are the values and the cultural identity, and then how do individuals contribute into that? I would call that at the archetypal level, and that is that's the work of theology. So the Western mindset is formed primarily based on a Judeo-Christian theological frame. And from there, we draw our values, ethics, and beliefs, our isms. So we shape, what we value, what we don't, and the structures of how we relate. From there, we drive out our economics, politics, and religion, our systems that we want to have shape our culture. And then from there, we go to the psychology of how do I, as an individual, contribute into this culture that we've now created? What is the meaning of my life in relation to these systems, these values, these beliefs, and ultimately this big story that we're telling ourselves? But what I would suggest, and now I need to tell you, I make all of this up, so you all should totally feel free to disagree. But what I think is maybe going on here is that we are living between competing narratives, that one narrative, again, has carried us about as far as it can carry us. And we're seeing the death throes of that narrative right now is in our current political system and election is most clearly seen. And then there's a different story that's trying to emerge, and that we're seeing pockets of it emerging all across the world at this point, which are very, very encouraging. And it's the story that I think the UCC tells really brilliantly. So the old story is at the archetypal or at the theological level, it's a story of hierarchy. The Judeo-Christian story is Christian story, I'll say, is God, Christ, husband, wife, children, right? There's a hierarchy that exists and it's fundamental to the framework. Or in Genesis, God says, in a very poor translation, but we've adopted it as on whole, is God gives the earth to man and woman, and says, have dominion, dominate this. And don't worry if it all becomes a hot mess, because in Revelation, it says that you will get an exit strategy. We'll just be magically pulled off this terrible place and saved as righteous people. So it's a story of domination without accountability. Is what we've told ourselves. I'm not sure that's biblically ethically true. So what we drove out then is a culture that built on hierarchy, then honors toxic masculinity and violence as its story. And let me hasten to say, this is not male. I'm not speaking about male or female behaviors. I've experienced women adopting toxic masculinity just as effectively as men have. But it's the authoritarian, right? It's the big man kind of syndrome. It's the Iron Man or Captain America or any of these superheroes that we keep holding up in front of ourselves. Because we chose that as our story that we're telling ourselves of the superhero that saves the weak, then it makes sense, doesn't it, that we would drive out our systems and our values, ethics, and beliefs based on a way of creating domination and control. And the easiest way to do that is by race, because the color of our skin is obvious. Like you see it when you look at each other. So there's not an easy way to hide in that. So we create white supremacy as our framework for thousands of years now that we've held that. And Christianity is the dominant religion that needs to be followed. And then because we've created, again, this hierarchical structure and story, capitalism makes total sense, because capitalism is a competitive economic model that pursues kind of endless growth and endless domination and endless consumerism. And in fact, now to the point that even if you want to be an ethical company, unless you file for B Corp status or you go to a nonprofit, you are legally required to make decisions in the best interest of your shareholders, even if it is causing great harm to the planet. So we've built economic systems that continue to hold up and reward that hierarchical competitive story. And then at the individual level, we're told from our very earliest days on Earth that ultimately we're in a framework of us versus them. This is your family, that's theirs. These are my people. Those are not my people. These people are welcome here. Those people are aliens. And so we other each other out of this fear, out of this sense of we need to compete because we're set up with that being the story ultimately that shapes the very air that we breathe, right? But again, because we're moving into this incredibly dynamic, interesting, diverse, global context, that story is only going to lead to our destruction. And so more and more people around the world and more spiritual spaces are waking up and saying, hey, that's not the only story that we can tell. We can tell a different kind of story, the one that starts with the fundamental story that in the end of the day, everything is connected. We're all interdependent, that your wellness and success is my wellness and success, that we're in this together. And if that's true, both with us individually as humans, but also with our animal friends and our planet and all living beings on this earth, then what that suggests is that we can have a pluralistic posture, that if everything belongs, then everyone belongs, that it's all a complement that builds into sustainability, which then drives out an eco-culture, an eco-civilization, which can live now in harmony and balance without overconsumption being the driving framework and force, and overshoot being the outcome of our partnership with the planet. And then what that invites at the individual level is a contemplative posture, not in the sense that I'm advocating we all go join monasteries, though I personally would be a great fan. You can lock me up in a monastery anytime. Contemplative in the sense that what's rewarded is not our ability to compete against each other, but our ability to actually develop internal wisdom, to be a mystic in a sense, the internal spiritual maturity that is possible in the human experience, even ideal in the human experience, that leads to the kind of wisdom and fortitude, commitment that's needed to develop a truly an inclusive and collaborative way of relating to one another in the midst of our differences. That kind of relating to one another, which is fundamentally the kind of the principal teaching of Jesus in the New Testament scriptures, requires a kind of spiritual awareness, a maturity in each of us that isn't possible without doing that kind of deeply contemplative work. And I think that's the essential work right now of congregations, which we'll get to in just a minute. So this is way oversimplifying, the dynamics of what we're living in. But what I'm trying to suggest is that we're actually trying to sort out culturally who we wish to be. What does it mean to be human at this moment? And we've got competing stories that and there is no guarantee that the old story doesn't win. And I think that's the kind of existential threat of this current political season, is the obvious ways in which these two stories are battling out with each other. But what's also interesting added to that is that we're living in this incredible age of technological development that is introducing, again, factors we've never seen before in human experience. The emergence of AI, which is just in the last 2 years, I don't know how it's changed your life, but it's fundamentally changed my work life in ways that I'm totally blown away by. We're seeing, the emergence of capacities to achieve things and to create things, to imagine things that we never could have imagined even 10 years ago. And so the scale of the pace at which you and I are living really is extraordinary in what we're bringing into existence. But we also have a challenge before us. And I think Meg Wheatley, says it really clearly and starkly in her book, Who Do We Choose to Be? She says it needs to be stated clearly at the outset that we can no longer solve the problems of this time at large scale levels: poverty, economics, climate change, violence, dehumanization. Even though the solutions have been available for a long time, they require conditions to implement them that are not available: political courage, collaboration across national boundaries, compassion that supersedes self-interest and greed. What she says, and what an increasing number of our theologians, our scientists, even our academics are saying, is that because we are missing conditions to solve some of the great challenges that we're currently facing, we're left with a series of interesting choices, one of which, in Meg Wheatley's sensibility, Brian McLaren would also include this as a possibility in his book, Life After Doom, which I hope you all have a chance to read sometime. She suggests that what we should be doing is forming what she calls circles of sanity, places where the human spirit can still experience generosity, kindness, and awe and wonder and creativity. That we may not be able to solve these huge challenges because of the conditions in which we're currently living. But what we can do is create these circles of sanities, or maybe we call them hubs of hope, that allow us to maintain the best of what it means to be human. And as I listen to that through the ears of faith, she's a Buddhist practitioner. I'm a Christian pastor. But what I hear is congregations. Circles of sanities are congregations. They are places where ideally we come to enter into a school of love, a place where we learn to become more loving, more kind, more compassionate, more generous, where we become we look, talk, and act a little more like Jesus, because we have been in community with each other and we've studied the teachings that are available to us. Forming these circles of sanity, in a sense, become a firewall, if you will, to the kind of trauma that may in fact be inevitable as we move into not future climate change, but even present day climate change, which I would posture is the single greatest threat right now to human existence and to life, actually, all of life on Earth. at the moment. So, I mean, no pressure, but I want you to understand that what you're up to as a congregation is literally life and death. I mean, it's scripting a story and creating a space where people can stay sane, where people can know that they're safe, they're healthy, and that they're challenged to grow in the best of ways and not in the worst of ways. Carl Rayner started or suggested that if the Christian was to have a future, he was a Catholic priest and said some years ago, if the Christian was to have a future, that he or she would be a mystic. That would be the work of the Spirit within us. So I've been the pastor of four congregations personally, and I've worked with hundreds of congregations across the U.S., Canada, and the U.K. Primarily. I have never found a better mission statement for a congregation than Micah 6:8. We try to create all these others, but it always comes down to this: what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. As circles of sanity, if that's what we were doing, is to create spaces where justice exists and lives in meaningful ways, where we treat one another with loving kindness and that we walk with humility, re-scripting this story of a loving God, not an oppressive and domineering God, then we really have achieved something that matters deeply. But in order to do that, there has to be a bit of a rebalancing in how we structure ourselves and understand what we're up to as congregations. In the 1950s and 60s, in the United States particularly, but I see remnants of this in other parts of the world, we did an interesting split. I think possibly in an attempt to kind of negotiate theological space in American culture. It's almost as if we made a negotiation with the Pentecostals and the evangelicals to kind of separate out some space for the mainliners. And so, in a sense, what happened in our movement is that the evangelicals took the personal spiritual development work. So, when you go to an evangelical church, and I'm thinking like big box, the conservative evangelical churches, the primary message that you get is, how is your personal relationship with Jesus? Right. And a lot of the music is, and I'm going to be snarky here, but I mean it, with love for our brothers and sisters in that movement. But, Jesus is my boyfriend, is, a lot of the theme of the music that they're singing there in those spaces. But it's a highly focused framework that is laser focused on your personal relationship. It's a piety framework, your personal relationship with Jesus. And interestingly, its rigidity at this point in its expression in many of these spaces requires you to sign on to a set of beliefs that actually are kind of beyond belief, that really are beyond logic. But increasingly, because of instability in our culture, people want certainty. And so they are willing to tolerate that. So the evangelicals take the personal spiritual development, the personal piety space, and they move really strongly into that. The mainliners, we took activism and social justice. And so many mainline congregations that I work with today, you can't really tell the difference between them and a nonprofit doing justice work out in the community, or them and a social club, group of friends who get together to do activist work in the community. But there's an atrophy of the spiritual depth, the personal piety, the mystic experience, the sense of awe, transcendence, and wonder that is so important to the spiritual life. And so we've, in a sense, our souls have kind of dried out, but our activism is extraordinary. So we protest the heck out of things, but our internal maturity and depth, in some cases, may be quite lacking. And then both of those traditions kind of gave to the Pentecostals the apocryphal and the prophetic, energy. And so we rarely do we speak in apocryphal or prophetic ways. Rarely do we hold that as a gift of the Spirit to be wisdom speakers into culture in the same way that the prophets of old would speak wisdom and insight to declare a clarion call back to our better ways, our kinder ways of being human. So what is asked for at this moment is the reintegration, a rebalancing of these three instincts, these three capacities. And I personally think that the mainline Christian movement in the United States, because of its current rate of decline, may actually be broken open just enough to be able to reclaim these things with a deep integrity and live them out in some really exciting and beautiful ways. So I want to just suggest that this is, in fact, the profound work is to reclaim the spiritual, deep internal individual spiritual experience of transcendence, awe, and wonder, and to deepen within ourselves or develop within ourselves a capacity for wisdom that allows us to speak wisdom into culture, to declare that prophetic voice in a way that is sourced more deeply than our current political framework might say. So again, Karl Rahner says, the Christian of the future will be a mystic, or he, she, they will not exist at all. My experience says that this is, he's on to something here, that this is the shift that needs to happen, particularly in our movement. But what we should also hold in mind and pay a particular attention to is that there is no one charismatic leader that's going to surface in the progressive movement that's going to have the answers. There is no, savior that is coming to organize our movement and reinstitute our values in ways that shape public imagination. The movement that we're now fully embedded in and committed to, the stream in which you and I are moving, is populated by hundreds of thousands of people who are glimpsing the sacred, glimpsing God in the world and speaking that out in the ways that they can, in the platforms that they have, to the audiences that will listen to them. And what that means then is that you are just as responsible as anyone else in joining in on that, in that hard and wonderful work, to reframe and recreate the collective story that highlights interdependence, pluralism, inclusion, and contemplative wisdom developing ways of being. So what, right? This is all interesting, but what the heck does it mean for right now, right? How are we being invited to change here? Well, here's what is so, right? If we just look at the context in which we're existing in, letting go of assumptions and blind spots, here's what the data tells us. This is a study that was published by the Hartford Seminary for their Faith Communities Today research. It is the longest study and the largest study of congregational attendance. There were a number of other factors that they also studied, but this was the one that shocked us all. What they concluded is that between the year 2000 and 2020, so in a 20-year time span, that the congregation declined from an average of 137 people in the average congregation in the United States to 65 people. I'm just going to say that one more time. So over a 20-year time period, the average size of a congregation in the United States was 137 people, and over that 20 years has now declined to an average of 65 people. And that was before COVID. So the research now would show that that number is even smaller. It is showing that that number is even smaller. So imagine then, like, just play that out in your mind of the capacities now of congregations, of what the capacities we used to have and the capacities that we may currently have and the capacities that we might have going forward, if you play out that trend in the way that it's currently going. The chart on the left, it shows that the number of small congregations has radically increased. So we've gone from, 5% of congregations being what they would call small to over 65% of those. Now add to that the interesting dynamic that nearly 90% of people who enter Christianity, like the big C Christianity, 90% of those people who enter Christianity, maybe having had no experience with Christianity before, or who maybe have had a negative, they come first. Their first stop on their journey are those big evangelical box churches. So 90% of people who are entering into the Christian stream right now are entering in through the evangelical megachurch doors. Now, the reason we should be grateful for that is because those are easy entry points, but they're not easy places to stay for a lot of people. So the great feeding stream into mainline Christianity right now are actually people who are uncomfortable with or who could never find their place in those evangelical settings, and then decide to test out or try mainline Christian congregations like those in the UCC and other denominations. So the feeding system, ironically, for mainline Christianity is coming through the evangelical systems, who are losing people at a rate that's basically on par with mainline Christianity as well. I mean, pretty mind-boggling, actually, when you start to map it all out. So let's just talk about some high-level things, and then I'll stop talking and we can have a conversation. So what is now becoming obvious, if it wasn't before, it certainly is now based on the data, is that worship services are no longer the main front door to most congregations at this point. It's one among many. Fewer and fewer people wake up each morning and say, you know, what is missing from my life is a lecture about God from, you know, somebody in a big black robe who's sitting on, you know, on hard pews on a Sunday. Let me just pause. Dan, I think you're unmuted and your background noise is coming through here. I don't know if you can mute. Thanks. So now what we need to think about is what are all the number of, you're still unmuted again. What are all of the front doors? What are the many ways in which the majority of whom enter in through small groups? So right now what we see are small groups are basically the front door of Christianity as a whole. That would be true of the evangelical church as well as mainline Christianity. What we've also now discovered, the data suggests, is that virtual worship is an add-on for audiences that are already religiously engaged. They're not necessarily creating new audiences for most of our congregations. So what the data now also says is that most people who attend virtual worship are already deeply invested in their congregation or in congregations as a whole. And usually they are elderly and or people with or who are differently abled, who can't easily get to a worship service. So increasingly we're seeing that virtual worship is not a way to gain new audiences, though I want to hold that loosely if you're having a different experience. Daily engagement, not Sunday worship, is the best way to measure vitality and growth. Again, a 7-day-a-week experience is what people are really looking for. Church closures will accelerate. We're already seeing that, but we're going to see a tidal wave of church closures over the next 10 to 15 years. That's going to radically reshape our denominational structures. And, you know, it'll be an adventure. It could be great fun. It can also be heartbreaking, but it'll be all those things, I suppose. And then our funding and staffing models, of course, have to be reimagined based on all these new realities of attendance trends, et cetera. I should say, when I started as a Methodist minister, and this was more than 20 years ago. At that point, regular church attendance was once every 2 weeks. I mean, it was a pretty standard. You might miss a week, but you know, you came twice a month. Today, what we're seeing is the average church attendance is every 8 weeks. So a person would say, yes, I regularly attend church if I come every 8 weeks. Now, if you think about the number of people you have to have cycling through your congregation to maintain critical mass, it's a pretty astronomical number of people. So again, it's changing the experience that we're having when we gather together. We will have multiple niche affiliations and associations. So another story, the last church I pastored in Atlanta, I had a number of couples who would attend our 11 o'clock service because they enjoyed singing in our choir. But they went to the 8:30 Bible study at the Episcopal Church because they really liked the teaching that congregation was offering. And then they were part of some of the couples, not universally, but some of them. There was a like a wine and cheese gathering, a small group thing that they were part of with the disciples. So people increasingly are choosing their own adventure, creating their own communities out of these different affiliations and associations that shift our definitions, but I've found them to be quite interesting and life-giving. I should stress, which I've tried to do throughout this, that climate change will be the issue for our children and grandchildren's generations. So congregations who are failing to address that or develop meaningful approaches to climate change, or speaking out at least on behalf of the climate and on behalf of the earth, will fall short in the review of our children and grandchildren's assessment of our current leadership. It is the number one issue brought up over and over and over again in the hundreds of futures labs that we have conducted with congregations across, again, North America. The progressive movement will invest in practices, liturgies, and theologies that will reconnect us to nature. Already there's this strong impulse, this deep respect emerging or re-emerging for Indigenous practice, and that's getting rewoven into the theological framework and narrative that we're reclaiming in the progressive movement, which is good to see. And we will continue to see a rise of spiritual leaders who work outside of traditional congregational settings. There's an interesting development, but we're seeing more and more corporations who are recognizing that the spiritual life of their employees impacts their productivity. And so we're seeing major corporations like IBM, Facebook, or Meta now, those spaces that are hiring spiritual guides, spiritual leaders to service their employees, most of whom the employees would not necessarily probably want to belong to a more traditionally structured mainline congregation, but whose spiritual wondering and questions remain nonetheless. So I want to close with this piece of art. This is again by the artist that I showed you earlier, Kumi Yamashita. And this was actually a piece of art that it was a solid piece of black fabric that she was working with. And here what she did was she actually removed pieces of black string in order to reveal this portrait from that fabric. And when I first saw this, I thought, what an incredible metaphor for what you and I are up to at this time, that you and I are the inheritors of an institution that was imagined in an entirely different age. And we've been gifted these incredible assets and these incredible traditions and rituals and songs and practices and orders of worship and, all the accoutrements of what congregational life means now. And what the current moment is asking of us is saying, what should we let go? And what's essential that we carry forward? What do we take out and what do we leave in to unveil or to reveal the next beautiful expression of faith or beautiful portrait or piece of art that is within? Michelangelo talked about when he said that the job of the sculptor is to uncover the art that is within, to pound away at this rough stone until this kind of beautiful statue emerged from within it. In a sense, what we're doing is doing the hard work of the pounding, of the pulling away what is not necessary to lighten the load, if you will, for what is to come. And that will be the gift that we will give future generations who we will hand off this great movement to. So we are, in a sense, unweaving some of the gains and the pieces of previous generations' hard work in order to create something even more beautiful for the time and the age in which we are moving into. And that's the gift of our particular moment in this particular time of history. So I've told you way more than I actually know. So why don't we have a discussion or a conversation or questions with the time remaining, and then you all can go have a life.
Let's give Cameron a round of applause and thanks. So do you want to open it up for questions, or do you want to are you directing us to move into small groups, or how do you envision this?
Well, it actually depends on how much time you have. But normally we just open it up for questions unless
Okay.
you all are expecting to spend.
Okay. Let me just offer my thanks and appreciation to you right now. I mean, that was an extraordinary presentation, bringing together so many of the things that I think we've all been thinking about, feeling, wondering, and synthesizing a lot of really, really important and profound things. So thank you for that. I also want to just make a real brief shout out to Jim Matchalot, to Bob McCracken, and to Bill Belluzzi, who did the work of matching us with Convergence. And Cameron, as you were talking, I felt very, very grateful, not only to you, but to the folks that did the work of finding you in Convergence, because I think it's you're speaking a language that I resonate with, and I think our whole community resonates with. So thank you very much to you, but also to the three folks that did that very important work for us. But let's open things up to all of you. And I'm going to have to serve as the mediator here because Cameron can hear through this microphone. So Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. I'm fascinated by this concept of becoming a mystic. What does that mean? How do we carry that forward?
Okay, so in case you didn't hear that, this is Elizabeth who says, first, thank you, and how do we carry forward this notion of mysticism that you talked about and that Carl Rauner has talked about?
Oh my God, can we nerd out on this for hours? This is one of my favorite questions. So all I mean by a mystic is mystics are people who seek unmediated experiences of God, who when we think of our great mystics, Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, uh, um, well, I could go on and on, but these are people who risked their own learning. So they respect tradition, but they're also pursuing their own learning of the experience of the sacred, and they trust their instincts in that. Because again, what we're seeing is a breakdown of the traditional theological story that has shaped Western culture. So what we need now are adventurers in the spiritual space, people who take seriously the UCC statement that God is still speaking, and that are actually opening themselves enough to listen to what God is saying, even if it is surprising, shocking, something that we haven't seen before, or might not fit within the traditional doctrine. So a mystic is somebody who's just open to having revelation revealed to them. And they do that through a series of disciplined practices. So this isn't an art form of, let's just go out and create our own spiritual movement. But there's a certain way of listening internally, a certain spiritual maturity and wisdom that comes in this practice of rhythming or patterning one's daily life in such a way that it tunes our ability to listen in that certain way. So the Benedictines, for example, talk about the way of life being structured around 5 different patterns. There's a time of rest, there's a time of prayer, there's a time of study, there's a time of work, and there's a time of community, or friendship, being together, playfulness in that space. And those kinds of rhythms create a kind of capacity, a capability within us to deepen our spiritual deepen our capacity to tune in to the resonance of God at work in the world. So that's what's really called on. It's at the individual level for a lot of us, this ability to, in a disciplined way that honors the tradition, but that also realizes we can advance the tradition, explore that mystic energy within us. And I can give you gazillions of books on that if you want to read more on it.
I love that phrase, advancing the tradition. I think that's a really, really beautiful, beautiful phrase and beautiful way of putting it. Other comments, questions? Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Slides that talk about what we needed to do. And the thing that said, what did I get out of this? The thing that struck me is that for a number of years in various boards on church, we've been trying to figure out how we convince people to follow our tradition. But what I get out of your discussion is that we need to evaluate which of those traditions we need to put aside and come up with new ones.
Yes.
Change how we look at the world, not convince them to look at the world or the religion like we do.
So
Can-
are you able to, you're able to hear?
I am.
You're-
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Good, good, good. I'll get out of the way then. Good.
Yeah. So, well, don't go too far. It was a Unitarian pastor who really helped me. It helped this click for me. When she said, it's as if a lot of these congregations are like a BlackBerry phone. Do you remember Blackberries? And we all, like those of us who owned BlackBerry phones, we thought we were the coolest thing ever. I mean, we really loved our BlackBerry phones. I was really loath to give mine up when that time came. But it's like most congregations are a BlackBerry phone in the age of the iPhone or in the age of Android. Like in the way that we're currently structured and in some of the traditions to which we cling, in this context of 2024 and beyond, it could be that we're an old technology, that the way that we are designed is not compatible with the needs or the wants or the desires or the instincts of the age in which we're currently living. And so that transition, it isn't as if, people don't want to communicate anymore, but the capacities of the iPhone quickly outshined the capacities of the BlackBerry. And so what we're needing to discern now is what capacities are essential that we carry forward. What makes us more fully human? What makes us look, act, talk, and walk more like Jesus? And then what are the things that we just don't need to hold on to anymore? They served us well, and we can celebrate with deep gratitude how far they've gotten us. But we can let them go now because there isn't really a place for them in that future world, and or they are a burden if we continue to force them into existence. And I think that's the discerning work that every congregation in mainline Christianity is going through right now, but probably yours too.
Maybe what we need to be exploring together is the capacity of the flip phone right now. Some of us are looking to go back to that in order to regain our sanity.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and actually, I mean, that's a good point because what we're also seeing is, this reclaiming of beautiful spaces, for example, the grand cathedral buildings, the stained glass, the old, beautiful music, the Gregorian chant is making a comeback, if you could ever imagine that, right? There are practices whose power still resides in this moment and is still of use. And so reclaiming some of those, is also part of our work.
Amen. Laura back there. Oh,
She can't see you unless you.
I know, but don't you hold on? Let her see.
But I'm also aware of those wonderful small group discussion questions that you had up, that maybe between now and the next time we meet with you, some of us could
Sure.
ponder those questions together. And if there's a way that you give us a little headliner for what we're going to hear in 2 weeks from you, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So I fully encourage you all to meet and discuss further. The question I find most helpful is what's shifted in you. So, what was important to you when you came in today that after this conversation is kind of less important to you? What can you let go of, and what do you want to hold on to? The next webinar, as I said at the beginning, is we're actually going to go on a tour of 5 to 6 congregations that are in the United States, I think mostly just the US, that are doing some really creative, generative things that are in the same kind of flow and stream of honoring the trends that we've just talked about. And the reason that I find it interesting and helpful to look at these other congregations is in most of our congregations, you only know what you know. Like most of us are, really committed to our current context, but we don't spend our lives, as I do, studying other congregations and what's going on in those spaces. But to go learn from them is a pretty powerful way of opening our own imagination. So what I'd like to do is just present you with some things that people are up to and see if that sparks any kind of creativity for you and what's possible in your context. So that's what we'll cover.
Thanks. Let's take one more question if we have it. Otherwise, we will offer our thanks and be on our way. Will the slides be available? Well, yes, that we made a video of this, so the video will be available. I don't know about the slides individually, but the video will be available, so you can see it that way. We did have one. I saw Eve's hand. I saw Sandy's hand. Okay.
I'm not able to hear this one. You may
Okay.
repeat.
No, not so far. But predictions about the growth of evangelical churches.
Oops.
Okay, yeah. So the question is about Christian nationalism and how this is influencing.
It's a real worry. So right now, evangelical churches are on the same decline trajectory as mainline congregations. So they're experiencing. We're seeing, a rise of people who don't want anything to do with institutional Christian religion, mostly because of the hypocrisy that they're seeing expressed in evangelical settings that gets covered by the national media. It is possible with this election that we actually see a strong nativist movement rise up, much like we did in the 1980s under Reagan, where we saw the rise of the religious right and a resurgence of that. I would argue that I still think it would be the dying days of that movement, but it may very well be horribly painful dying days. There's a great deal at stake, actually, in us not allowing Christian nationalism to get more further rooted than it already has. But the attraction to it is the certainty that it provides. And again, it upholds that hierarchical, toxic masculinity narrative that is really important right now to a shocking number of people in our setting. So most institutional religion at this point is experiencing decline, and that's because we have possibly an unreconcilable and unsalvageable injury to the brand, and that it may in fact need to be reinvented under some other expression that eliminates both the theological vagueness of the mainline movement and the theological rigidity of the evangelical, and something else emerges from it.
Well, I think we need to bring this session to a close, but listen, I want to thank all of you for being here and being a part of this, and for asking really, really thoughtful questions. We'll continue to think together about these trends, about what Cameron has presented to us. But Cameron, I especially want to thank you. I'm going to step in front of the camera. I especially want to thank you for
being with us today virtually, and I want to extend an invitation to you to come and hang with us sometime.
I would love it.
Because I think you're speaking a very similar language that we are, and anyway, really grateful for all that you've shared, for all that you presented, and I'm grateful that we get to work with Convergence this year, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
All right, sounds good. I just sent an email to you all. Ignore it, please. So I sent you an email that I was confused about scheduling, but ignore it because you've clarified it for me this morning.
Thank you.
All right, see ya.